My day began as an intake manifold gasket leak, but became much, much more. I will share many tips and tricks as I tear this motor down. The first component I removed from the air-fuel system chain was the throttle body, and it had a severe gasket leak. As I removed the upper air intake plenum, I noticed it also had a severe gasket leak, as evidenced by the thick black soot caked on the outside of the plenum chambers. The forward passage on an intake manifold is the water passage. A gasket leak allowed the coolant to seep into one of the forward bolt holes, severely corroding the bolt, and when I tried to remove it, I twisted the head off. After removing all of the other bolts, the intake manifold slipped free, but the shank of the corroded bolt still protruded from the head. I was able to twist the remaining portion of the bolt, but it snapped off also. I attempted to drill out the remaining portion of the bolt. I had no success, but I decided to pull the head and send it to the shop to have it drilled out professionally. The head gasket is made of layers of metal and fibers, and this one was severely delaminated and leaking. The driver's side head gasket was also leaking, but because it was better seated, it was more difficult to remove and got distorted. The white, powdery coating on the center two valves of this head indicate a blown head gasket and a coolant leak. With the passenger side head removed, you can now see the carbon buildup on the exhaust ports indicating the gasket was leaking. Also notice the corrosion around the water passages in the timing cover. The water pump was leaking at the gasket and also from the weep hole, indicating the bearing seals were worn out. A water pump is not a serviceable component and must be replaced. The slots in the bench were used to organize the nuts and bolts as they were removed from the engine. Here they are further organized and placed in bags for easier installation. Look carefully at the air injection manifold below the fuel pressure lines and see if you can find the crack. Also notice the exhaust gasket leak on that too. It's important to always pay close attention to the components and inspect them as you remove them. Note they will be cleaned and further inspected with a strong light when the removal process has been finished. With the fuel lines capped and the engine covered, a thorough cleaning and inspection was performed. With the engine installed, this air injection manifold is tucked down in tight, dark quarters which would be very difficult to find the source of this leakage. Every gasket I had encountered to this point was leaking, so I knew it was time to remove and overhaul this engine. Ford marked the pistons for orientation, but I marked the pistons for relocation. The orientation markings ensure the piston rides up the thrust side during the compression stroke, crosses over at top dead center, and it returns down the opposing side of the bore. Here the timing cover, timing chain, and camshaft have all been removed. Before removing a connecting rod end cap, scribe the mating surfaces so they can be reinstalled on the same rod in the same orientation. The crankshaft was cleaned, inspected, and the bearing journals were lightly polished. The roller lifters and push rods were replaced during the engine overhaul. The engine was inspected by an engine shop and found to be within tolerance. The cost to have the heads overhauled, the cylinders deglazed, and the cam bearings installed was much less expensive than the cost of the specialty tools needed to do this job only once. I had my doubts if this oil pan was salvageable. The rust and pitting was extensive, but the oil pan gasket surface was intact, so I gave it a try. I was so happy with the results, I invited the oil pan and valve covers to join the party. It was no accident that these were sandblasted in a rusted wheelbarrow. It allowed me to recycle the sand, and the overspray did double duty cleaning the wheelbarrow. This remarkably clean engine block did not spend time with an acid bath, but had a visit from the pressure washer. Because the connecting rods were never removed from the pistons, a media blaster was out of the question. The carbon was massaged free from the pistons with a pressure washer without damage to the surface finish. The parts were dried with compressed air and oiled immediately after. To easily install the cam, I improvised a cam insertion handle using a piece of all-thread and a piece of plastic PEX tubing. It was simple, cheap, and effective. I used parts I had on hand, and it allowed me to install the cam and rotate the cam so the lobes cleared the bearings. With the cam in place, I installed a set of high-quality timing chaining gears and rotated the motor several times to ensure that nothing was binding. With the distributor temporarily installed, next I installed a new timing cover. I topped off the motor literally with a set of Scorpion Racing Products anodized aluminum roller rockers. Great care was taken to torque the rockers under preload pressure. If not, a push rod will be bent or two. The injectors are seated into the fuel rail and the intake manifold with seals and held in place by the two bolts in the fuel rail on each side. To remove the injectors, simply remove the two bolts and pull up on the fuel rail, and the injectors will pull free from their seats. The injectors were removed and cleaned in an ultrasonic bath of alcohol. The seals and the fuel strainer were also removed and replaced with a kit ordered online. A plastic syringe was attached to the top of the fuel injector with a rubber hose. The injector was cycled on and off as the syringe was pressurized to check the fuel spray pattern. The original color was gray. My wife wanted a silver engine, and it was her Bronco. The motor is being installed without the accessories or the upper intake manifold to make the installation easier. An engine load balancer was installed to allow easier alignment with the transmission bell housing. It can be adjusted to allow a precise angle of attack with the transmission. With oversized tires, my engine crane would not lift the motor high enough for the flywheel to clear the hood latch, so I turned the motor sideways and passed it over the shallow part of the oil pan. Because I install engines alone, I designed some alignment pins using all thread. Once the threads pass through the transmission, I install a nut and draw the motor together and start the bolts. With the engine and transmission coupled together and resting securely on the mounts, the engine crane was removed. I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I did making it. If you did, please leave a comment, a like, and a share. Subscribers are always welcome,